We're going to be covering how to add CSS styling into your HTML page, also how you can select elements and apply some simple properties, values to those elements in order to have them rendered out within the web page. CSS is not a programming language like JavaScript, and it's not a markup language either like HTML. So CSS is a style sheet language. And the purpose of CSS is to take a plain HTML structured page, select the page elements, and apply styling to the elements. I've got a basic HTML page, and we're going to be adding some styling into the page elements. So there are several different ways that you can add styling into the page. So you can add it directly within the style tags. Select the element with a tag of header. I would specify the element first. So this is the selection of the element that we want to apply the styling to. And then apply the styling properties that we want to set. Set the color of the text within the header element. We would specify color to red. So then we specify a value, which is going to be a value of red. So what that did is that transformed the text within the header, made it red. Styling can also be applied directly within the element, within the style attribute. So specifying the style attribute, and here we're going to set a background color. So styling properties are going to be the same, and then we just assign a value to it. So I'm going to assign a value of black to the styling properties. So we're setting for this element the style property of background color black. And what that does is that transforms the background color to black. One of the main disadvantages of placing it within your HTML is that it's hard to find, hard to update, and you need to go through the elements. And what happens is when you set it as a style attribute, then this is actually going to be overriding the other styling properties, because this is going to be coming to the closest part of the element as it's directly within the attribute. So if we were to update this to black, what happens is it's actually going to be overriding the style header. So whatever we change this to, it doesn't matter, because we're adding another style property to it in order to be adding it directly within the page elements. You should avoid adding it as a style attribute directly within the page element, and make a selection with it either using within the style tags or within the style sheet, which is the best practices, as when you are adding it with the style sheet, there's a lot of advantages of making it really easy to update, share the same styling across multiple HTML pages. And what a style sheet, a separate file that's going to contain the styling for the HTML page, and this is a file that gets linked to from within the HTML text. So we set up a link tag, and then using the href, linking it over to where the style sheet is located, and then using the rel attribute in order to, this is going to be a style sheet. So let's go ahead and we're going to create a brand new file. I'm going to keep it within the same directory, and that's where we're going to be applying the style sheets and the style properties to the page elements of the HTML file. I've saved it as style CSS, and then let's link to this CSS the same header, and then we're going to apply a color to that header. So let's update that and set the color to the text to be red. So now that we've selected the element, applied using the style sheet, updating the page element with a tag of header, and that's changing it to be red, because we're going to be working off of the style sheet. And this is going to be the separate file that's going to contain all the CSS. If we were to create a second HTML file, we can link it to the same style sheet. So if we create a second one that's called index2, and we go over to the second page, so make an update to it. So that one will say 2, and the original one will still say 1. And now if we want to select and update the header on both pages, all we have to do is make an update to the style sheet that they're both going to be linked to. And now that's going to be applying the blue color to both of the headers across both of the pages, because they're both linking to the same style sheet. And that's the benefit of using a separate style sheet in order to make updates to the styling, that you can really easily link to it and make updates to it, which is going to go across all of the files, that all of the HTML files that are linking to that particular CSS file. The CSS starts by setting up a selector. So this is going to be the element, and the element that you want to apply that particular rule set to. And this can also apply to multiple elements that are the same. So if we're selecting all of the elements that are list items, this will apply it to all of the list items. When we select the list item, we see that the bullet points now are all blue on all of the list items. You can also apply it to all of the anchor tags. And now that's updating the text on both of the files to be blue for the anchor tags. And that's the selector. The selection process is what's known as the selector. And then once you made the selection, the next is you select the property that you want to use. In this case, we're using the property of color, and we're setting the property value to be blue. So changing the property value will apply different value to that color property. And both of these together are going to be what's known as the declaration. So we're declaring the color property to be set as red within the anchor tags selected from the web page HTML file. You can add multiple property values into the rule set. So within the selection, within the curly brackets, just adding in a second line, going to set the background color, and I'll update the background color of these to be black. It's going to get applied to all of the matching elements that are matching that selection, where we're using the semicolons in order to make a separation of those different statements. So even if we were not to have separate lines, this will still work as long as we've got the semicolon that's separating out those property values to separate it out so it is more readable within the CSS file where we're setting it to a new line. The CSS property name and value separated by the colon. So go ahead and create an HTML file. You can add in a number of HTML elements, apply styling, create a new CSS file, select some elements on the page, and apply some styling to those elements, and you get ready to move on to the next lesson. We're going to be exploring how we can make selection. So selection is key to picking out the page element that you want to apply the styling to. You can use either the tags, the IDs, classes. You can also do a combination where you've got the element and specifying the class selector. There's also a wildcard, so this gets applied to all of the page elements. You can also group the selection process by selecting multiple page elements, various selectors, and comma separating out the selectors. In order to apply styling, you need to make a selection of the elements. So we've got a number of different page elements on the page, and we're going to be making selections of those elements. So first off, you can select it using the tag. So whether it's the div, the header, the nav, the unordered list, or the list item, we can select it using the tag, and this will select all of the page elements that are matching that selection. So for instance, if we want to select the nav, let's go ahead and we'll make a selection and then apply the properties to that. I'm going to update the background color property of all of the page elements that have a nav, and we'll set the background to be yellow. So within the visual area of the web page, HTML page, we can see that the background goes yellow to the nav. Let's select the list items, and we'll also apply a background color to the list items. I'll select it and set it to a blue background. So what we can see happened here is that the nav, which is the parent of the unordered list and as well as the list items, gets a background of yellow, but because we've applied the background specifically to the list items, which are nested within the parent, we see that we get a blue background being applied to those elements. You can also select elements using their IDs. So let's go ahead and we're going to add in an ID. We've got several divs on the page, and this is another way that we can distinguish block of code that we want to apply styling to. This one, an ID of 1. So we can select that element using the hash and specifying the ID name. And I'm going to apply a background color to this one as well. And we'll set this one to be red. So we see that this particular div now has the property of background color being red being applied to it. So if we were to select all of the divs and apply a background color of beige to all of the divs, the one that has the selection of the element with the ID of 1 still is red. If we move this property down below, we see that it's still red because we're more specific on the ID and applying the background color of red. And if we were to remove this, the div is also getting a background color of beige being applied to it. Another way to make a selection is using the class. So we do have a div with a class of wrapper. So if we want to select that element with a class of wrapper and set a background color to that element, and this is going to be the parent of all of the elements, select this and set it to be purple. So now all of the elements are going to get a background color of purple. The ones that are nested inside of the wrapper are going to have different styling background colors being applied to them. And that's going to result in this type of effect where we've got the parent getting the original color, the children within, we've also setting different colors for them, and that's affecting how it's being output. You should only have one element with a particular ID. So this is a unique way of making a selection of the page element. When you're selecting it with classes or the tags, there's possibility that there's more than one element that's going to be represented. So if you want to be really specific with the page element, you can select it using its properties. And we've got an unordered list with the list items, and they've all got anchor tags inside. So if we want to focus in and list item, I'll give it a class of highlight, and I'll also give the second one a class of highlight. So we want to select all of the list items. By adding the highlight class allows us to make the selection of those elements. And that we can do when we're selecting the list items, join it together with the class of highlight, set the background color for these. So set the background color to be green. So now we've selected these page elements and applied a background color of green to them. So these are the list items with the class of highlight. This styling allowing us to zero in on those elements and apply the styling to it. We can also select using the wildcard, and this is going to be something that can get applied to all of the page elements. So if we want to set a color of pink to the text, the wildcard selects all of the page elements. In addition, we can group selections together by comma separating. So let's go ahead and we're going to go back in and add several different IDs, and we'll add one more element with an ID of 3. And if we want to select all of these matching elements on the page, we can comma separate out. So selecting the element with an ID of 1, ID of 2, ID of 3, and then also let's select the element with a class of highlight. So all of the matching elements are going to get this property applied to it, and this is how you can group the selection. So we've selected elements with an ID of 1, 2, and 3, and also the elements with a class of highlight, and apply a color of red to those elements. So all of the matching ones now have a color of red. The rest of them are pink. And I'll actually update this to be white because we've got background colors for all of them. And that's how you can group the selection process, select multiple page elements, and apply the properties to all of them. So go ahead and try it out, create your HTML, and make a selection using the tags, the IDs, and the classes, and you can be ready to move on to the next lesson. This lesson's all about colors and the different units of colors that we can add to the background. And that's the background of the page element that we've selected, as well as the color, which is going to be affecting the text color of the page element that's been selected. And then how you can add images to the background, the shorthand for the images, and then the different types of color values that we can use, such as the RGB, the hex value, the RGBA, or just the named values for the colors. That's all coming up in this lesson. Let's go ahead and make a selection of some of the page elements. So we'll select the element with the tag of article within the selection, and then apply some properties to that element. So selecting that element, and we're going to be applying a background color. In order to set a background color, we use the property background color, and then from there we can select the various colors. So colors can be added using the color names, and most of the typical color names, so just being listed within the editor, and these are the commonly used color names, and you can specify the background using the color name. Let's select another page element, and we'll select the element with the ID of 3. There's a lot of different options for setting the color values. You can use the RGB values, so that's the red, green, blue values, and this is done by indicating the RGB. And then the parentheses, setting a value from 0 to 255. So 0 being so that 0 would be representing the amount of the color that we want to apply. So 0 is the lowest. If we want to apply as much as possible to the red RGB, we would set it to 255, which is the max. We're going to set 0 green and 0 blue to the element with the background with the ID of 3. So that results in a red color. Select the element with an ID of 1 and do a background color. Use a hex color value. So hex values are 6 character values within a hex format, indicated with the hash in order to indicate the hex value that we're going to be using. And similar to what we saw with RGB, the first 2 characters in the hex are going to represent the amount of red. So starting at a value of 00, which would be the lowest, and ending at a value of FF, which would be the highest value for the hex. So we're going to do the same as we're applying 0 green and 0 blue to the background color, which is also going to result in the red background color. There's also an option for a RGBA, and the RGBA allows us to set a transparent color. So I've created another element with the ID of 4, and we'll select that, apply background color to the element with the ID of 4. And this time, instead of the RGB, we'll use the RGBA. And that's going to be indicated with RGBA. And the last value within the RGBA parentheses is going to indicate the amount of transparency that we're going to be applying to it. So 0 would be applying 0 of that color to the element. And we see that this is the element with the ID of 4. So there's no color that we visibly see that's being applied to it. We can go all the way from 0 to 1. If we do a 0.5, that's 50% of the content being applied to the alpha of the color block. And that's where we get this lighter shade of red. And this is actually going to be transparent by 50%. So if we had an element or content underneath, we would get that value being shown. So if we were to set a background color for the body, and I'll set the background color to be blue, the result for the RGBA is going to be resulting in a purple color because it's shading the 50% of the color using the background, which is blue, and using 50% of the RGB color, which is red, and that's going to be resulting in a purple shade. If you update the RGBA to 1, that's going to be no transparency, and that's going to be the full color value, and that's where we're getting a value of red being applied to it. So when you are using the RGBA, what's underneath and the colors underneath are going to matter as to what the colors are that are being used. There's also where we can set the color of the font. So let's select the color of the font using the color property. And for this, we can apply a color value to it as well. And this can be either the named color values, RGB, RGBA, in addition to the hex values for the colors. There's also a property that you can use to add opacity to the page element. So much like what we saw with RGBA, where this is all within the one statement, and set a value for that. And if we set the opacity value for the element, what happened is that we did get the opacity, but that was applied to both the font and the background color. So that's where the font is going to be slightly blue, because the font is also getting that 0.5 opacity applied to it, as the background has the 0.5 opacity applied to it. So that's going to now match with what we've got with the RGBA. So that's how you can use the opacity to apply opacity to the background. For backgrounds, you can also add and use images. And then we need to specify the URL of the image within the parentheses. We do have an image located directly within the same folder, and that image is going to be called logo1.jpg. And when we apply the background image, we see that what happened is that now the background of the body has the image contained within it. And that, because the image is going to be smaller than what we've got to cover the full background, that's where we get this effect where we've got the repeat on the vertical as well as the horizontal. If you set a image that's going to be transparent, so this is a transparent version of the same image, we see that now we've got the background is showing because the image is being placed on top and we still have the background color of blue showing beneath it. So if we were to make any updates to the background color, so it's setting it to a grayish color, that's going to result in the background still showing, but because we're using a PNG file, that's going to be transparent and we can see through the image to the background. You can also control the background for the repeat of the background image. If you don't want a repeat, or if you only want a repeat on the horizontal or the vertical. So let's shrink down our view to 100, and this way we can see the repeat within the display area. So using the background repeat, we have an opportunity to set how we want it to repeat. So we can set it to repeat X, and what that will do is that's going to repeat it on the X axis. If we set it to repeat Y, that's going to repeat it only on the Y axis. So only just have the one image, and that's being repeated all the way down within the page element. There's a number of other options for the repeat. Set it as repeat, and that's going to be what the default is, where we're setting it and it's repeating across the entire page. So a no repeat, so that's not going to repeat it both on the vertical or the X axis, the horizontal or the X, so it'll only show the one image. So that's how you can control how the image is being repeated within the background. If you are only using just the one, you can also set a background position, and the background position is a property that's used to specify the position of where the background image will be set. So we can position it from the left, and we can also do left bottom. There's also right and top. So now it's going to be positioned in the left bottom. This is going to move it over to the right bottom, and then there's the right top. And because we don't have a lot of content in there and the top are going to be the same, if we make it larger and if we move this down to the bottom, then we're going to be able to see the actual positioning of the bottom. So now it's positioned at the bottom part of the page. So it sets the starting position of where we're setting that image. There's also an attachment value. So if we set it up at the top of the page, the background attachment, and what this will do is this is going to set the property that's going to specify whether the image should scroll or be fixed. So that's the attachment, and there's a fixed or scroll position. So what the fixed will do is it's going to fix it in place. So even if we're scrolling, it's going to keep the background image in the same spot. So it's not going to be scrolling where we're scrolling with the page content. If we set it to be scroll, which is the other option, now as we scroll, the image will move up. So as we have less space on the page, and if I was to make it even smaller, we'd see that as we're scrolling down, that image moves with the scroll bar. There's also a shorthand format for all of this. Get it out and we can set all of these individually, but we can also set this as a group. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out the properties here. So removing it, and you can make comments within style sheets by using the /*. And then when you've completed the comment, you just do the asterisk and the / and that will break back into and break out of the commenting. So let's go back to the backgrounds, and we're going to set this all within the shorthand format, setting up the color, the image, the repeat, the attachment, and the position. And this is all done within the one background property. You can also use just the background and set a background color. So this will also work. You don't have to add all the other property values. If you want just a background color, you can use the shorthand instead of writing out background color. And from here, you can add in additional values into that property. So you can set the URL just as we did with the background image. There's the image being set. The next option is the repeat. So if we don't want it repeating, we can specify no repeat on it. Same as these 3 lines of code. We can also set the right top position. You can set the scroll, and by default it's going to be scroll. So let's set that to be fixed. So we're fixing it in the right top. So we're scrolling down. That image is now fixed to the right top position of the page. And it's not moving with the scroll, which is the default action. And this is just a shorthand method that you can use in order to set all of these properties and values within one line. So go ahead and try it out. Update the colors of the font as well as the background colors of the page elements. Try out the RGB, the hex, as well as the RGBA, and then set an image the background, and you can be ready to move on to the next lesson. So this is going to be covering the box models. It has different parts, being the border, the padding, the margin, and the width and the height of the element, so the dimensions of the element for the content. And as we can see in the right-hand side within the browser, they do have a computed representation of the box model, as well as the visual within the web page at the top. We're going to be making adjustments to the padding, the border, the margin, and the content dimensions. So lesson we're going to be focusing on the box model. So the box model is a term that's used when we're talking about the design and the layout of the page elements. So every single element on the page will have a representation of the content, so the height and the width of the content, the padding of that content, there's a border that's going to wrap around it, and then the margin is going to be outside. And that's going to represent all of those different parts that are going to be contained within the box model. If you are using a Chrome browser, you can select an element, do an inspect, and then within the inspect, if you scroll down to where we've got the styles and the computed styles, it will give you a representation of that particular element's box model. So we've got the margin, the border, the padding, and the default width and the height. So there are additional margins that are added because of the block content. So let's take a look and we'll make some adjustments. So first off, we'll select the page element that we want to apply the styling to, and that's going to be the element with an ID of 2, and we'll set a border so that we can see the boundaries with the inner content, and the border can be set using the border width. There's also a border color that we need to set, and then the border style property, and this can also be done as 1. So I'll show you the shorthand for this afterwards. So that allows us to apply the border around the page element, and now within the box model we've got a border of 1. I'll make this slightly smaller, so we do have it zoomed in fairly big. So I'll make it smaller so it's easier to see it within the screen, and then that way we can also see the box model that's associated with it. So there is a way to write this as shorthand. So I'm going to / and comment out this, and you can just do it as border. So most commonly you will see it written as border, because without all of these you're not going to see anything for the border. So set the width of the border and set the style of the border and the color of the border. So that's going to allow us to apply that. We can update these values. So if we do a 5 pix for the border, that's also going to update within the box model. And we notice that within the element itself, within the border, the padding is contained there. So let's add some padding to that page element, and you can set the padding just as we saw before, where we can do a padding top and set a number of units that we want to do the padding. You can also do padding bottom, and that's applying the different paddings to it. There's also the padding left and right. So set the padding left, set it to 15 pix, and set the padding right. So that's applied the padding. The padding is on the inside of the border and outside of the content area. For the content itself, let's set a width of 200 pix, and we'll set a height of 200 pix. So that will change the dimensions of the main container, and I'm actually going to set this to be 100 so that we can still see it visibly on the page. So now that has updated, whereas when it was just the default styling for the element, that was taking the properties of the div. So as we resized it, it was taking the entire width across of the available width of cross. So now we've got a set height and width. So just as we saw with the border, we can set the border the padding properties within the shorthand format, and that's going to be all done within the one line. So when we're setting the padding, the first set of padding, so if we set a padding of 5 pix, that's going to apply 5 pix all the way around. So we see that it gets applied to the top, the bottom, and the right and the left. If we can set another value there, this is going to be setting the top and the bottom is going to remain at 5, and the left and the right are going to be getting 10 pix. So if you have 2 values within the shorthand for the padding, it's going to apply it to top and bottom first, and then right and left next. If you add in 3 values within the padding, it's going to use a clockwise type format where the first value is applied to the top, the second value is going to be applied to the right, the third value is applied to the bottom. And because there's no fourth value yet, then it's going to be applying the left and the right position. So that's going to be applying the left and the right padding the same. So it's going to be 10 padding for both of those. And then lastly, we can add in a fourth value there, and that's going to allow us to apply padding to the top, the right, the bottom, and then the left side. And you can see that being represented here and rendered within the box model. Let's also look at what we can do with the margin. So just as we saw with the margin, margin top, bottom value, those are going to be added into the box model. They take place within the page, and we also have a shorthand method that we can use on those. Let's set a background color for the element. So setting a background color, and I'll set it as red. So this way we can see where the boundaries are of the page element. And notice that the red color is can be contained within the padding as well, and everything up until the border. But then outside of the border, if we're using the margin, that's not going to be added to the element. So that red color is not going to be added to that element. So setting up the margin, and just as we saw with the padding, and we'll start with the 20 pixels. So that's going to add a margin for the top, bottom, and all the way around. If we do 10 pixels as the next value, that's going to be for the left and the right values. So just as we saw with padding, the margins are going to work the same way. And then I'll add in the other two options. And now we've got separate padding and separate margins for all of the sides of the page element. Typically we do use the shorthand methods for the padding, for the border, and for the margin in order to apply the styling to these page elements. So go ahead and try it out. Make a selection of a page element and apply updating the box model property values to that element. And you can be ready to move on to the next lesson. We're going to be covering the various ways that you can update the fonts. So that includes updating the capitalizing using the transform, updating the decoration, so underlining and removing the underline, adding a shadow, indenting, line spacing, line height, updating the font size using the shorthand method for the font size and the font family. Also how you can select from Google Fonts and bring those fonts families into your web page using the line height to center the content vertically, as well as using the text align and aligning it either to the left, right, or center. And all of the commonly used font properties that you would encounter with CSS are coming up in this lesson. Let's go into our HTML. We're going to select the element with an ID of 2, and then we're going to add a border around it and apply some updates to the properties and the styling of that. So set the border, and I'm going to set a one pic border and make a red border around it so that we can see the page, the content on the page. Zoom in so it's slightly larger. And now let's make some updates to the text. So we know with the text we can set a color. So the color is set using the color value, and that can update the text color. There's also other properties for text, so such as the text align, and that allows us to either to center, to justify, left, right. So there's a number of different options. So if we set it to right, what happens to the text is that it aligns to the right, and by default it's aligning to the left. You can also center align the text, and that will center align that text content within there. I'm also going to be adding in some margins, so it's not exactly directly right on the border, and I'll make it slightly larger. So do a padding of the page element, and we can also add in some margins if needed. So that can highlight it a little bit better where we're seeing where it's aligning. And notice that the alignment is taking place to the end of where the padding is. So if we were to set it up as left, we still have the padding on the left hand side. I'm going to bring it back to center and save that. There's also a justify. And what the justify will do is it's going to spread that out more equally. So it'll look like the text content is spread equally from the left to the right. And in this case, because the second part of the sentence ends, it's not able to adjust text for the equal width for the left and the right margins. But if we were to add in additional text into it, so I'll just duplicate the text content, that justify now is trying to equally spread out the content between the left and the right side. Text decoration. And there's a number of options for this. So there's an underline, there's an overline, a solid. None is the default, so there's no decoration on the text. Although if you are using an anchor tag, by default that there are decorations on those. So let's do the underline for the text content. And then we'll select the anchor text and do the text decoration. If you want to remove out the default text decoration of the anchor, then you could set those to none, and that's going to remove out those default text decorations. Line through that you can do, and this will do the line through the selected text. There's an overline option, so that will place the, instead of the underline, it'll overline it, so place the line over top of the text. Can transform the text, so using the text transform option. So if you want to capitalize the text, which it probably already is capitalized, you can convert it all to lowercase, and you can also convert it all to uppercase. So select the anchor tags and update these all to be uppercase text. So that will uppercase everything. I'm going to select the header content, and we'll capitalize the header element. So selecting the text transform, and then capitalize and update that to be lowercase, and then the display is going to be showing it as capitalized text, such as you can do a text shadow, and that provides a shadow effect. So you need to specify where you're positioning the shadow. So setting it up as 4 pixels over, and then 4 pixels down. So that gives us the shadow effect, and then the green is the shadow color, the text indent, and then specifying how much you want to indent the text, which will indent the text starting at what the first character is within the selection. Letter spacing can be used to identify the space between the letters. So that's the letter spacing property, and this is expecting a unit value. So setting up the letter spacing of 10 pixels will space out the letters using the values there for the 10 pixels between the letters. You can also select the line height, and the line height sets the height of that particular line of content. So by default it is set to whatever the font size is. So you can set it to a different line height, and that will space out the spacing even more. You can set a font size, and the font size can be either an increment or it can be set as a value, either the pix, points, EMs, so any one of the units that you can use. So I'm going to just use the pix and set this to be 20 pixels, which will make the font size larger. And if you don't have the line height, the default line height will be set to the 20 pixels. Also use the line height to vertically center. So if you just have the one sentence, so within the wrapper, we've got the header, the div. So let's make a selection of that element. So header div, set up a height for this element. That's going to be set to 100 pixels. Horizontally center the text. I'll add in a border. And if we set the line height to 100 pixels, now that will now vertically center the text within the element. You can also set the font to use. So that can be set using the font family, and that will update the font. These are the default fonts that are showing up within the editor. So you can select from those, and those are default fonts. You can also get fonts from external sources. I typically will use Google Fonts in order to select a font. And this is a website that you can go to, select fonts, and bring them into your project. So going down, and there's over 1,400 fonts right now at the moment that you can select from. So you'd go through here and select the font that you want to use. And I'll select this one. Make a selection of the font. It's going to give you an example of the way it's going to look. Select the view selected fonts. And now you can get the code to bring it into the font. So there's the CSS for the font. We can go and apply that to our web content, setting the font family. You also need to bring the font in. And it shows you how you can do that, where you can link to the style sheet. And the best way to do it, if you want to do it directly within your CSS file, is you can do the import. And the import will allow you to bring it in to your CSS file. So any of your HTML that's linking to the CSS file will then have access in order to use that font. So now when we look at the company name, it's set within this font that we've selected from the Google Fonts. Let's update the font size. I'll make it really big to 3EM. You also have an option to set the different styles. So it's different font styles. So I'm going to go ahead and select the font styles within the anchor text. And there's options. By default, you're going to be using the normal. You can set it to italic, which is going to angle it slightly over to the right-hand side. You can also set a font weight, and there's number of increments there. You can set it to bold, bolder, and that will just bold the font content that's been selected. You can also do this as a font shorthand. So I'm going to go ahead and select another page element where we've got the ID of 1. So select that page element, and then we'll apply some different font properties to those. So set that up, and I'll add in a border so that we can see where the location of this page element is. So that's the one that we've selected down there. Let's add some padding to it. Also update the font size. It's a really big font there. The font shorthand, we can apply some different sizing properties to it. So instead of using the font size, can bring that into just under the font, because you do need to have two properties, which is the font size and the font family. So if we want to update this and include the font family that we brought in from Google, we could do it within this type of format. And now that's going to be applied, and we've done it within a shorthand format. So you do need to have the size and also the font family, and you can add in additional ones such as the italic. So that will italicize the font, and that just provides a simpler way that you can write out that font content. So these are some of the commonly used font properties within styling. So go ahead and try it out, make some selection of the page elements, and apply the various styling properties to the elements. And you could be ready to move on to the next lesson. This lesson is going to cover what the display property does and the different values. So commonly used are block, inline, and inline block, as well as display none. So how they're going to affect the page elements. And then the difference between visibility hidden and display none, and how they're going to show up on the web page. The display property is one of the most important CSS properties that you can use in order to control the layout. So by default, some of the page elements, such as divs, already have a property to it, and that's the display property, whether it's going to be a block or inline. So when you are creating page elements, and I'm going to create a couple here where we've got a div, and then within the div, I'll add in some spans. So spans, what they do is they're inline, and that means that they're not going to take up a new line of code. So by default, the spans are going to be inline, and the divs are the ones that are going to be taking up the full block of code. So if I was to update and to wrap that first word my with the new line with the div, it's going to move it over and set it to a new line, whereas the spans are going to be inline. So let's make a selection of those elements, and we'll make some updates of those page elements. So selecting the header that has the div that's immediately underneath it, and that you can use using the greater than sign. I'm going to select a border. So add a one-pick solid black border to that selection of the div. And then the contents that are contained within that div, I'm going to update the spans. So selecting the spans that are contained within the div, and this is going to apply to all of the spans that are contained within this parent element, and set the display property to be block. So what happened is that the spans now got the same display property as the div, where they're going to take a new line. Add in a border. Now they're going to be going on a new line. So setting the display property to be inline. And because we don't have another element that's inline to it, that's why it's not setting it next to each other. So let's go ahead and we're going to update the HTML, and we'll have the two values there, and these are both going to be divs, and now these are divs that are going to be inline. I'm going to also add a border around them so that we can distinguish them in the visual area of the page. So set them up as blue. So now that the divs are inline, the spans are block, we can see the difference between the two. Block level elements start with a new line, and they will take the full available width from the container. So if we were to update the width that's available within the header, which is the parent container, and we set a width of that, and I'm going to set that to 200 pixels, the blocked containers, the block display elements are going to take the full width of that. There's also a display none. So I'm going to select the nav element and update that display property. So that's going to be the hyperlinks that we have on the page. And I'll set that to display as none. So what happened is that that actually disappeared from the page, and it's still within the source code, but the display none simply hides it from view. And this is actually going to be different than visibility none. So let me bring that one back, and I'm going to select the element with the 1 to hide that one. And then we'll select the element with an ID of 2 and use visibility and set the visibility to hidden. And the difference between the display none and the visibility hidden is that the hidden is still going to take up the space on the page, whereas the display none completely removed that page element from the display area. The background color of it, so it's more visible, and then we'll hide it once again using the display none. So when I update this to say display none, it's going to disappear that yellow block from the visible area of the page. Let's go ahead and we're going to select the list items on the page, and we'll update some of the properties of the list items on the page. So unordered list items. And what we want to do to apply to the list items, we're going to update the display, and we're going to set the display to be inline block. And when we do that, what happened is that it still retains the properties from the unordered list. There are some default properties, that's why it's indented, but with the display none or display inline block, those allowed us to align those horizontally. And that's how typically the navigation menus are created, where we've got an unordered list and we clear out the items from the unordered list, the default properties such as the margin, any padding. So removing that will bring that directly in line. I'll also set the border so we can see the entire unordered list and set the border as one pick solid green. So that's taking up the full block space, but we've removed out the margin and the padding, so that allowed the list items to align to the left. Inline block is going to be slightly different than what we have with the inline color for them, so that we can see where the boundaries are of those elements. So that's going to be the inline block. And if I switch it to inline, see there's a little bit of extra padding that's going to be around with the block. So a little bit of extra spacing between the inline and the inline block. So there is a slight difference between the two. And there's going to be a bigger difference if we take the padding and if we add padding to the elements. So once we add the padding to that, switch it to just inline, the inline elements are not going to take the parent sizing. So you see that when we're just using the inline, although we're able to apply the same padding, looking at the parent of the unordered list, now that's going to be smaller than what we've got for the sizing. So we do need to get those block properties using the inline block. So it's a combination of between the inline and the block, and allows us to take the full height of the parent. Try out the display none inline block display property value, and you can be ready to move on to the next lesson. Position specifies the type of positioning for the element. So we're going to be looking at the commonly used ones, such as the relative, the fixed, the absolute, sticky, and how you can use those to position page content. And then as the page content scrolls, you're going to see a difference in the behavior between the various elements that have the different positioning properties applied to them. With the position property, we're able to select an element and set its position on the page. So let's go ahead and we're going to make a selection of some of the page elements. We'll select the navigation bar. And for the navigation bar, I'll add a background color so that we can distinguish where it starts and where it ends. So that's going to be their navigation bar. And that within the nav, we also have some unordered lists and a bunch of list items, and then some anchor tags that are contained within there. So let's go ahead and we're going to update the position of this element. So let's set the position, and I'll set the position to static. And what static does is static positioned, it's not that it's positioned in a special way, it positions it according to the normal flow of the page. So setting it to a static position, and I'll make the text a little bit bigger so that we can scroll. I'll also update some of the content, so the article element, and I'll update the height on that so that we are able to have some scrolling for the page content. So with the static position, that's going to be the default position. So there's no special positioning for that element. We can use the position relative, and the position relative allows us to update the position from its normal position. So when you set it as just position relative, it's still going to be in line with the normal flow of the page, but using position relative allows us to update the left and the top position. So if I wanted to move the entire element over to the right by 30 pixels, then this can be done using the position relative. And with the position static, it's going to ignore that second property. So it doesn't allow you to do the left or the top. So you need to set position relative, which allows you to set the other properties and position that element, making adjustments to where it's sitting on the page. There's also a bottom position for that. So if you set it to bottom 40 pixels, so it's coming off a bottom of 40, and that's coming off the bottom of the parent element, off of wherever the original position was of that containing element. I'm going to add in to the wrapper class, and I'll set a height of this to be 400 pixels, and then we'll also do a border around it. So one pick, solid black. And so there's our wrapper. So now we can see the top and the bottom for the wrapper. If we select an element and if we use the fixed position, this is going to fix the element in the same place even if the page is scrolled. So we're going to go ahead and we'll select the header element and set its position as fixed. And I'll also add a background color for this element. So just set it up as black. So that's going to be the fixed position of the element. And generally when you are using the various positioning, let me also update the color to be white. With the fixed position, typically you would set a width. So give it a width and do a 50% width. So once we save that, we see that we've got a 50% width. There's also a left that you can set. So just as we saw with the relative, the fixed allows us to position it in a particular part of the page. And this is going to be relative to where the screen is located. So if we have a larger size screen, then that's still going to be sitting within the 25% and 25% off the top of the page size. So as we move it up, that element will move up as well. I'm going to update this to be RGBA so that we can actually see the content that's underneath. So setting up it as an alpha version. And I'll give it 50% transparency so we can see the content that's underneath the fixed position element. Also going back to where we set the bottom. So if we set it to be 0, this is going to actually be the same. So 0 bottom and 0 top is going to be wherever the default position was. So as it was static, it would be still sitting within that default position, although we're not moving it over left by 30, but the top position would have been still the same. So if we move it back to relative and we update it, that's going to be updating where it was originally supposed to be positioned at, and that's going to be updating that position value. There's also a position absolute. So this is the absolute position, and it's relative to the position of the ancestor. So it's not relative to the viewpoint. So such as fixed is relative to the viewpoint, the absolute is going to be relative to the parent. So let's go ahead and we're going to select page elements, and we'll select the one with the ID of 2. Actually, we'll select the one with the ID of 1 and update that. So we've got a whole block of text there. I'll set a background color so that we can see it on the page to yellow. So it's going to set that block of text to be yellow and set its position. So set the position to be absolute. And I'll use the same positioning values that we had there. So now it's being set as absolute. But the difference is that as I'm scrolling, that fixed position still stays the same, but the absolute only starts out to be in the same spot. I'll update the display to be none of the nav. And so when we default and we start, that this is going to be positioned at relative to where the parent is. So if we were to update the wrapper, and if we were to add a margin to the top of the wrapper of 40 pixels, that will also move it down and update where we're fixed positioning it. So as we scroll it, it's going to still be in relation to wherever the main page content was. And I'll also update this to be top, and we'll set it at 100 pixels, and as well for the top of the header, it'd be 100 pixels. And I'll use an RGBA for this one as well. And so you can see how that one is moving differently than what we've got for the fixed position. Because once again, it's positioned. And if the positioned element has no positioned ancestors, it uses the whole document body. So let's add in some positioning to this. So if we set a position of relative to the wrapper, and from here we do a 10 pixels. This is now affecting where the absolute position is being set, because the absolute does set in relation if one of the ancestors does have a fixed position. So then it will set it to where it's located within the ancestor. There's also a sticky position. So I'll select the element with an ID of 2 and set this to be sticky position. Also set a background color for this element, and I'll set this background color to be green. Set the top at 0 pixels, and that element is going to be sticky, and the sticky will toggle between the relative and fixed depending on where the scroll position is. So let's reduce the size of the article, and I'll increase the size. So as I'm scrolling, we see the sticky is going to be switching. So for depending on where the scroll is and the position is set, it's going to update in the view area. So as I'm scrolling down, it stays sticky there, and then as I continue to scroll, then it goes up to using the relative position. Shift between the sticky using both the fixed and the relative. Make sure that you do have enough content so that you are able to scroll so you can see the differences between the positioning and the positioning properties values. The float allows you to position content on the page, so you can build different columns on your page. What you can do with that, where you can position it to the right or to the left, can clear the float for the following page elements using the clear. How overflow works with the float and the floated elements, align them within the rest of the page content, and how the float affects the following elements that are siblings of the elements that have the float applied to them. So that's all coming up in this lesson. Float is used for positioning and formatting content, particularly for images, as well as previously used more for creating the page layout and structure. Now we've got the CSS grid as well as flex, which we're going to be covering a little bit later on. So now we want to select the image within the element with the ID of 1. So go through and make a selection and select the element with the image tag. And let's go ahead and we're going to apply some properties to that. So I'm going to set a width of 100 pixels, and actually I'm going to use the max width. So if the page size gets smaller, and the way that max width will work is that the maximum width that we're going to see for this image is going to be 400 pixels. So even if the page size allocates and is allowed for more, we're going to be sticking with the maximum width. I'm going to reduce this to 100 pixels so that we can better see the way that the floats are going to work. If we want to float this in line, so right now we see that the image is going to be in line directly with the content, but we're positioning the content, we're not positioning the content directly around the image. So you can use floats in order to fix this. So setting up a float, and if we want to float the image to the right, that's going to wrap the text around the image. Let's add in a border for the image. So one pick solid, and I'll add in a red border so that we can easily see where the image border is. So that allows us to add and have the text wrapping around the image. We can also float it over to the left-hand side, and that will do the same effect, but position it on the left-hand side. So you can also select the list items within the nav, and let's apply a float to those. So set up a float of left for the list items. And what happened now is that we've got the list items, they're floating right next to each other. And with the floats, you do need to apply a clear, otherwise the float property will still be applied to the next element. And that's where we've got this type of effect where we're not clearing out the list items, and where we should be clearing out and having a clear. So in order to prevent it moving on to the next element, we can set up a span, and within the span, let's give it a class. And I'll just call it clear float. And that way we can select the clear float. And for the unordered list, I'll add a border around the unordered list so that we can easily identify where the unordered list ends and stops. And where our floating, we notice that within the unordered list, we're not getting the height of the unordered list. So the background, if we were to apply a background color to the unordered list, and I'll just apply a background color of black to it, it just comes across as a line because of the float that we're floating it over to the left. If I was to remove the float, that would cover the entire elements. But as soon as we float it to the left, that's going to be taking those property values and applying the float. So I want to add in the float clear. And what this is going to do is this is going to allow us to clear the floats. We can clear the float left, we can clear the float right, and then we can clear float both. So usually, typically, you're going to use the clear to clear both the floats. I'm also going to select the article and apply a border around the article. And we're also going to apply the class of clear fix to the A side. As you can see that what's happening here is as we're floating it over to the left, this element is still retrieving that styling to it to float it over to the left. So that's if we do the clear float, that will then move the next line within the A side back to its default position over to the left-hand side. If we update the overflow of the unordered list, so if we set the overflow to be auto, that's going to then set the height and the dimensions of the parent as we're floating it. So that's where we got the full coverage for the black part, that we're allowed to select that element. And now it's taking the properties of the float and prevent the element from overflowing its outside of the container. So we can as well set that to the element with the ID of 1 and do the same where we can set the overflow. And that way it will provide enough spacing for the element as we're floating the content over and still allow us to move to the next part of the page elements. You can use the floats in order to create columns within your web page content. So let's go ahead and we're going to create a main column area and set up a few different divs. I'll just give them a class of COL for column and then give them different values contained within the content so that we can distinguish them. So these are going to be 3 columns that we're going to set up. They're all going to have the class of COL, and we're going to use floats in order to create a free column design. So going over to the style sheet, select the element with the COL class and add in a border, and so that way we can distinguish between them. Then apply a float. So let's float them over to the left hand side, and notice that we don't have the clear fix. That's why that content is still being, the following content is still being floated. So we need to apply the clear of the following element. So that's going to be for the 1. So that will realign that as we're clearing out the floats for the elements. Let's set the width for these, and I'll set it at 33.3%. The reason that we're not able to do the full 100% is because the border. So if we were to remove the border, then they would stack right next to each other. There's also another way to fix that where we can apply the box sizing. And what box sizing property allows us to do is to include the padding and the border in the box's total width. So let's apply the box sizing property to all the page elements and set the box sizing to border box. Count for the full padding as well the border for the elements. And this is giving us the ability to align them. I'm going to add in some padding for these elements, and we'll also set a height for the elements. So that gives us some more spacing around the elements, and that's how you can create a 3 column using the float. And as long as you're clearing the float from the next sibling element, and also if you have content that's overflowing the floated elements, so if we have the images contained within each one of these, there's going to be an overflow. So you can set the overflow to hidden, so that will hide any overflow of the content. Or if you set it to auto, that will automatically readjust the height and allow us to scroll in order to see the full contents of the element as they've been floated. So those are 2 options that you can do with the overflow in order to fit the page content in properly. So go ahead and try it out on your page and get more familiar with what you can do with the float property and the different values that are associated with it. It's going to be a fun lesson where we're going to be focusing on the pseudo classes. And what pseudo classes do is they allow us to make selections as well as define the state of an element. So typically used on anchor tags where they've got the link, the visited, the hover, and the active. You can update those styling properties. It's not limited to only those elements, the anchor tags. You can place it on any element where we've got the hover. So in case we're hovering over, we're getting a red border for the images, and the other elements that we're hovering over are going a light blue. There's also where you can make a selection, so first and last child. You can do the nth child, which allows you to do even or odd. So you can do alternating styling for the siblings. Also specifying the checkbox, checking to see if it's checked, and applying styling when it is checked. And there's also the focus pseudo class, which updates the styling properties when the focus is applied to the elements. With pseudo classes, you can define the state of the element. So if the element, and this is typically done when we're using hyperlinks. So let's make a selection of the anchor tags, and we're going to update some of the pseudo class properties for that. So typically we do have a value for the link itself, and these will change depending on if it's already been clicked. So this is a default property of the hyperlinks. And if you want to change those, so all of these links that we currently have, if we set them up as a brand new link, so that means that the link hasn't been visited, we can set the property for the link, and let's update the color. So that's going to mean that if we have a hyperlink that hasn't been visited, that will go red. And I'll update this to have a different value. So now we see that the ones that haven't been visited go red. We also have links that have been visited. So let's set a default brand new value for the visited state of the link and update that. And the ones that have been visited, let's set that to be green. So that goes for all of the other links that we have. You can also set a hover effect. So whenever you hover over the link, so right now by default there is no hover effect to it. So sometimes you're going to do that, you've got the text declaration and set that to none. So as we hover over it, the underline disappears. You can also update the background color of the elements. So as we hover over them, let's set them to red, and we'll set the color of the text to be white. So that gives you this type of effect that you commonly see within the navigation menus. There's also an active state. So let's select the elements and update its active state. And active, let's set this as this type of color for the active. And what active means that whenever it's clicked down. So as I'm hovering over it, if I press it, then that's going to go green. So that's going to give us the active. Let's also update the font size, so it's a little bit more visible as I'm pressing it. So when it is clicked, it gets big, and then when I release it, it goes back to the default sizing. So that's the active state, and those are typical pseudo classes that you might have, that you have for the anchor tags. So it doesn't have to be just on anchor tags. You can set it up on other page elements. So for instance, I'm going to select the images. I'm going to set the width of the images to be 100 pixels, and we'll set the height of the images to be 100 pixels. So that will make them a lot smaller. Let's apply a pseudo class to them. And whenever we hover over the images, I'm going to select the border, and we'll set up a border of 3 pixels, and it'll go red when we hover over it. And by default, let's add in a border for the images to be black. Otherwise, the images will shift in their position. So whenever I hover over them, now they're getting the red background. Let's also add for the div and a pseudo for the div. So whenever it gets hovered over, let's update the background color and set this as the background color. And actually, let's not set that to the main div, but we'll set it to the elements that are contained within the main. So selecting the element with the class of wrapper, so that's going to be the main element, and apply that to all of the elements that are within there. So all of the child elements within wrapper that are immediately within wrapper, now we're going to have that hover effect being applied to them. So that's all of the main sections that we had within the web page. So you can also use the pseudo in order to specify one of the child. So if you wanted to get the first child of wrapper, you can specify the first child element. So this is another way that you can fine-tune the selection process. Let's update the background color for the first child and set it to red. So it's going to be the first child of the wrapper. And I'm actually going to go down to where I have the divs, and I'll give this a class of a row. So it will select the first child that's within a row. So it's going to be a little bit better to use. So within the row, we want to select the first column. So we can do that by selecting the class and then selecting the first child of the element. So it's going to return back the matching first child within the list that are all going to be on the same level. So all of the columns are on the same level. That's where we're able to select the first child. You can also do the last child as well. So selecting within the row, and we'll update and set the last child property. So you can set that to blue. You can also be specific. So using the nth child, so that will be the number of children. So if you want to set it for every second element, and then we specify the number that we want to skip to. So this is going to be applying it to every other element for every second element. And I'll update the color of the font to be red. So right now it's only going within the element. And let's copy these and we'll duplicate them out. So that way we can set to multiple elements that are the child elements. So when we're specifying using its index value, so that's going to relate to the second one. Let's update and set a background color and set the background color to green. So again, it's going to be the second one. We can update this to select all of the matching ones that are odd. We can also update this to select all of the matching ones that are even. So that will be applying it to all of the alternating elements. Let's go ahead and add in a checkbox within our page. So there's our checkbox with check me. I'll give it a class of checker, and we'll do a few of these. So we've got the check me 1, check me 2, check me 3, and check me 4. So that gives us some checkboxes on the page. And now let's select the elements that are the input with the type of checkbox. We can be more specific with the input types by using the square brackets and then specifying the type. So this is going to be one of the attributes of the element. And so we want to apply the checked option to it. So checking to see if it's checked and then apply some styling to it. So what we want to do, let's set a height of 50 pixels and a width of 50 pixels to this checked element. So when they're checked, they're going to get really big. There's also a focus pseudo selector, so that can be applied if we're focusing on an input. And let's update the background color of it. So set that to yellow. And I'm actually going to update and add in some additional just regular inputs. So now these inputs, whenever they're selected and the focus is on them, they get the selector of yellow. And the checkboxes, they're still going to be updating as they're checked, just as we did with the checkbox. So selecting the input and then also selecting the type as text. So that will apply that property. And some of the properties are not going to be available to all of the page elements. And those are just being set as the default background colors for them. Try it out and see what you can do with the pseudo classes. Try out the different pseudo classes on various page elements. And you can be ready to move on to the next lesson. So this lesson, we're going to be updating the part of the selected element. So updating the first line, first letter, adding in content after and before the element selection. And this is all going to be done with pseudo elements, where we're using the 2 colons in order to indicate the pseudo element and apply styles to part of the element that has been selected. Pseudo elements are allowed us to create and select specific parts of an element. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to make a selection of the page content. So we've got a number of page elements that we've already got. So I'm going to select the one with an ID of 1, and then we're going to apply a pseudo element to that. So selecting the element with the ID of 1, and I'll update the font size of the element. So make the font size relatively big. We can also update the image size. This image is rather big, so let's update the width of the image to 100 pixels. So it's a whole lot smaller. So now let's apply a pseudo element. So if we want to apply it to the first line, we can specify that within 1, and this is using the 2 colons that allows us to indicate the pseudo. So selecting the first line, and let's update the first line and add in a red color to the first line. So that's going to be to the first line of the content. So as the line shrinks, it's still only getting applied to the first line. So this is an interesting way that you can apply different effects to parts of the element. Let's update the background color, and we'll set the background color to be black. The color of the font, we'll set that all to be white, and I'll set that as beige. Let's update, and we'll make a selection of the first letter within that element. So selecting the first letter, and I'll update the font size of the first letter. So we'll make that 4 EM. So it's a way that you can update the first letter, make it really large. You can also set content after the selection of the element. So you can select the element, and using after allows you to add content after the element that you've selected. And we can specify the content and adding in the content of hello world. So there's the content being added in. I know it's a little bit hard to see, so let's update the color to be blue for the entire background. So there's the content that's set after within the 1, and if you go to inspect the page content of the element, there's the after, and we don't see the hello world being written, as that's being done with the styling. So whatever is in that place is going to be what the content is that got added. You can also do a before as well. So that will place the content before. So that actually added it into the first line and updated the content, so applying even the first letter to that first part of the page content. So pseudo elements allow you to select part of the element and make updates to it. And they are limited to the different properties that can be applied. So go ahead and try it out to get more familiar with what you can do with pseudo elements. We're going to be setting up a basic website with floats. So we've got the typical header, navigation, the menu, and the footer. And we're going to be using the floats. So it floats for both the 3-column design as well as the navigation bar links, applying the different pseudo classes and the pseudo elements in order to clear the floats, and then applying various styling properties in order to make it look like a website. We're going to update this typical web page layout to have a 3-column design. So we've got a header, navigation, the main content area, and a footer area. Making a selection of these, and then we're going to be adding these using a float. So first off, let's go ahead and we're going to open up the styling and clear out any styling that we had there previously, and apply the border box because we are going to be using the floats. So that's going to be done to all of the page elements. Selecting all of the page elements and set the box sizing for those page elements to be border box. So that way when we set up the columns, which is the next one that we're going to be selecting, we can set a width for those to be 33%, and that way we can have them fit properly on the page. So I'm going to set them to be 33%. Also add in a border for them so that we can clearly see all the different columns. So that can be one pick solid black border. So there's our columns. Let's set a default height for them, and the height can be 200 pixels. And then using the float, we can float them to the left. So set them up as float, and I'll float them to the left. So that sets up the basic for the 3-column. I'll also do a text align to center align the text that we have, and set that as center aligned for the text. So we've got the 3 columns there, and we want to set the footer. So I've added in classes for the footer and for the header. So selecting the footer and the header, and then I'll set them up both. So just comma, separate out both of those selections. I'll set the text align, and we'll center align the text. We'll set the background of both of them, so they're both going to be matching, and set it as a black background. The color of the font can be white. So there's our footers there. And it's actually being applied to the columns because we didn't clear afterwards. So we want to clear after the selection of the main content. And I'll give this one a class of main so that we can select it within the styling. And we want to apply the clear fix for that main element. So selecting it and then using the pseudo, set it afterwards. So we're going to set some content there. And this will allow us to do the clear fix on both of those. And the content can just be some blank content. And set the display as a table display. And then using a clear to clear both of them. So clearing all of the floats and do a clear of both. So that will once again allow us to have the header and the footer separated, and because these columns, because of the float, they were floating on top of the header and footer. Let's set a height for these, and this can be 120 pixels. And set the line height for them so that we can center align vertically align the text. And of course, if you're adding in more text, then you'd need to update what the line height is. So right now I'm not going to be adding any additional text, so I'm just setting it up as the line height. Also for the navigation bar, so it's going to be the nav bar. I'm going to give it a class of nav, so in case we want to reuse the tags, different parts of the page, we're going to select it as a class of nav. And for the navigation bar, we can align the text to center align. Let's do a background color for the content and set that up as red. Let's also go ahead and we're going to add in some divs in there. And then we'll use these divs and we're going to align them using the floats as well. So selecting within the nav, the divs, and we can also do the divs that are immediately within the nav, and set that up to float to the left. Add some padding for the divs, 10 pixels. And we also want to do the clear fix for afterwards. So comma separate. And that's also where we've got the floats. And this should also be set to after. And I'm going to set this one as well to after. So we're setting that div to clear afterwards. And for the divs, set a width of 25 pixels. Set a width of 25 pixels. Also center align the text because we do have the 4 items there within the list. And I'll set a background color for each of them. So I'll set the background color to be red and the font color can be white for those. So there's our links. Whenever we hover over them, or they're not links yet, but we'd have to add in the links. So we're going to update the background color whenever they're hovered over. And I'll set the background color to be black. And the color can go to red. And that's how you can set up a basic website with floats. We're going to be creating a CSS template using Flexbox and setting our typical HTML template where we've got the header, the nav, the main, and footer, a 3-column website. Flexbox provides us a way to create a web layout. This is also going to be responsive, so as we resize it and make it larger, those columns are going to stay, creating responsive elements within a container that are really easy to arrange using Flex. This lesson we're going to be making and using Flexbox in order to make a 3-column website design. So we're going to be selecting the elements from the page and updating them. So let's go ahead and we're going to select all of the elements that are columns. And this is where we've got the 3-column design. I'm also going to apply to all of the elements across and add in the box sizing. So that way that we can set the default sizing of each of the cells, and that will also include the padding and any of the borders. Box sizing will allow us to include the borders and the padding for the width of the element cells. So we're selecting all of the columns, and I'm going to add in a border to the columns. So one pick solid, and I'll do a blue border for the columns. So there's our 3 columns that we want to apply. I'm also going to be adding in some padding to the columns. So set up the padding, and I'll do just 10 picks of padding to it. And I'll set a default height for it to be 200 picks. So there's our 3 columns. Do a text align so we can align the text to center for them. And now we want to stack them using the flex. So let's set the flex width, and that we can set using the flex property of 1. So it's going to be the width of each one of those containers. And we need to select the parent and apply the flex property to the parent. So that's the columns are contained within the main element. And within the main element, update and set the display property to be flex. So that will allow for the children of the main container to get that display property, and that's where we get the 3-column design. We can also update that and set the navigation. So we've got an element with a class of nav, so just comma separate them, and we want to apply the flex property to both of them. And immediately that's going to stack those. So we want to apply different properties to the navigation elements, and these are all of the ones that are the divs within the nav class. So selecting the nav class and then the divs that are contained within them. Let's go ahead and we'll set up a border for those. And I'll set up a green border for them. So that way we get some borders around them, adding in some padding for those. And let's set some 5 picks of padding for them. And then using flex, we're going to set the flex value for 1. And also do a text align to align the text to center align the text. So that gives us the link elements. Setting up a background, I'll set up a background color for the page elements, and I'll set them up as black, and then the color can be blue. We're actually going to set the color to be white. And adding in the hover effect to those elements. So whenever the elements are hovered, to give them the feel that they're going to be links, and then we can apply the linking afterwards, either with JavaScript, or we can do it within the HTML as anchor tags. So whenever we hover, I want to update the background color. And we'll set that to be blue. So as we hover over, it gives us a new background color for those elements. Now let's select the header and the footer. So the elements with a class of header and the element with a class of footer. Apply some properties to that. So once again, background color for those. So there's our background color for those. And I'll set the overflow to be auto. So that will take up all of the available space. Text align, and we'll center align the text. And we'll set up a minimum height for it to be 100 pixels. So that gives us the header and the footer, and also do the line height for these. And actually for the footer, we'll select out the element separately. So we've got the div within that element. So selecting the div where we've got the content for the footer. And for this we can set a margin and then also some padding around it. And this way we can add additional lines of content. So that's how you can use Flex in order to set up a default website template with 3 columns. We're going to be applying the display grid, so the CSS grid, in order to create a basic template 3-column design with a navigation bar that's going to be fully responsive. Using the CSS grid gives you ability to create responsive page elements. So I'm going to be showing you how you can create a basic starter template that you can use for your websites to develop them out further as you add additional content and elements into them. So starting out with a basic, very basic layout, we're going to have a header, nav, main area, and a footer for the content. So this lesson, we're going to be setting up the website design and the layout using the grid. It's going to be a 3-column website. So first off, let's select the main container, and that's going to be the container main. I've already added in the box sizing. So this is going to be the parent that's going to be displayed, the children, the immediate children with it as a grid format. So using the display and set it up as display grid. And then for the grid, we're going to set them up as 1FR, 1FR, and 1FR. So that right away set those columns in that type of structure. Let's update the columns. So selecting the elements with the columns and set up grabbing the border, set up the width of them. And they're going to be set within the grid, so we want to make it dynamic. So we don't actually have to set the width, but we will set the height for those cells. And also I'll set the text align to center align the text content within them. So there's those 4 columns. And you can also shorten this by using the repeat. So if they're all going to be the same size, then we can use the repeat and setting up a repeat of 4 with 1FR for each one of those. And actually this should be 3 because we do have the 3 columns there. We're also going to do this for the navigation. So we've got a element, the class of nav. So that's going to be the parent for the grid. And then the navigation items are going to be contained within there as a grid items. So setting up the grid, and this one is going to have 4 items, 4 children within there. And we'll select the nav and the divs that are immediately within the nav. So the element with the class, and then the divs. So these are going to be the links. We can text align, also set up a background color, and I'll set up a background color of green for those. I'll update the font size to 1.2 EM, and we'll set a color of white for the links. And we'll add in the option whenever we hover over them that will update the color. So the pseudo, and we can set this. So setting this, and how about we set this to be black whenever they're hovered over. So there's our links, and the grid is going to be responsive by default. So that gives us the basic structure that we needed. And now we can apply some additional styling to the header as well as to the footer and set up a background color for those. I'm going to set up just a default black background, and the color of the font can be white. Let's select the font size. So make it really big. And then the text align. We'll center align the text for those. So that gives us our basic web page structure where we've got the header, the footer, and I'll also set the overflow for these. So that way they will go down all the way to the nav bar, up the default spacing that's needed within the structure of the page. And then as you resize it and shrink it down, these are going to also be fully responsive page elements. So that's how you can use the grid in order to set up a default website template that you can use as a starting point for developing your web page.